Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Dan Porterfield. I'm the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute. Thank you. Thank you. And we're so excited about this extraordinary opportunity today with this panel of leaders to take an insider's look at the Affordable Care Act and how it became law, what its future is likely to be. And I'd like to especially thank Ruth Katz from the Aspen Institute, who's here today, for incredible leadership. Well, two things are certain. One is that healthcare in America will be controversial and a subject of great debate for years and decades and elections to come. And secondly, that Julie Rovner, guiding a conversation about healthcare, is as good as it can get. And Julie, thank you so much for being here today.
She is so knowledgeable.
She's the chief Washington correspondent for Kaiser Health News and has the podcast, What's the Health? For many years before that, she was the health policy correspondent for NPR. She covered the passage of the Affordable Care Act right there on the ground as it was happening and knows these gentlemen very well. So Julie, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming tonight. I am so honored to be here with this amazing panel of the 5 people most responsible for making the Affordable Care Act a reality. This panel is called Legislators Who Built Obamacare Look Back and Ahead, but I'm calling it Secrets of the Health Law You Never Thought to Ask About. This is the first public appearance together of these current and former lawmakers. They each chaired one of the top House and Senate committees during the drafting and passage of the health law. And I have my own special shout out to Ruth Katz, thank you very much, for bringing this panel together and for letting me moderate it. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves and tell you briefly, please, about their committee's contribution to the law. Then I will make them stop. Then we will all talk for a while. Then I will open it up to your questions, audience, so be thinking. So let us get started. Senator Baucus, why don't you go first?
Thank you, Julie. My name is Max Baucus. I'm from the state of Montana. I served in the House 4 years, we all came the same year, all of us, except for Sandy. He's just 2 years later. We're Watergate babies.
1974, for those of you who don't remember.
Correct. And served in the Senate 36 years, chairman of the Finance Committee for a good number of years, most notably during the time that we worked on the ACA. Personally, it's the most satisfying legislative effort I've participated in the Congress during that 36 years. And basically the Finance Committee was the committee that provided the money to pay for all this. I loved it. We were intensely involved in passing the ACA. We in the committee, about almost 2 years. That was our constant focus. But I'm very proud to be here, and thank you, Julie, for doing this.
Senator Dodd?
Chris Dodd from Connecticut, 6 years in the House, 30 years in the Senate. I'm the accidental member of this group. I was the ranking Democrat on the Health and Education Labor Committee. I had been appointed chairman of the Banking Committee in January of '07, but my great friend and one of the people totally responsible for the ACA and many others, Ted Kennedy, became very sick with brain cancer in the early summer of 2008. And so in late fall of that year, he asked me to move up and become, in effect, the acting chairman of the Labor Committee in the Senate. And I stayed through it. He died, as you may recall, in August of 2008. And then Tom Harkin took over the committee in September. But I was involved in that whole process, at least for the year or so, as the acting chairman of that committee.
Congressman Waxman?
Henry Waxman. I was chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, which had a primary jurisdiction over a lot of the health issues in the Congress. We had Medicare that we shared with Ways and Means, Medicaid, the public health programs and everything else. And our committee, along with the other chairs of the committee, worked very closely this time around after we saw the failures during the Clinton years to make sure that we were working pretty much on the same bill with some exceptions so that we could finally put it over the line.
Congressman Levin.
Sandy Levin from Michigan. I came into the Congress in '82. So let me just briefly reflect on the state of Michigan, because it was John Dingo's father who in the 30s began the fight for health care for all Americans. And it came through his son, and then my colleagues here who were so instrumental in passing something. And I finished by just reminding us how difficult it was. And we chatted, the five of us, and we talked about our stories. And if each of us told how difficult it was and all the ramifications, it would take not an hour, but it would probably take a week. But I think we want to pay tribute to Aspen for bringing us together to give just a bit of a slice of what it took to pass something that we have been trying to pass in this country for 50, 60, 70
And your
years.
committee's role? Your committee's role?
Ways and Means.
Ways and Means. I became chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and all of us Democrats spent endless hours around this table. Among the things, don't believe, is that we didn't know what was in there.
Congressman Miller?
Speak for yourself.
I'm George Miller from California, and I was elected also in 1974. And when I was running for office, I ran to end the Vietnam War and to have national health care in the country. And so when I had an opportunity to do it, when this bill was presented to us, that we could do that in the Congress, I was chair of the House Education and Labor Committee, which had jurisdiction over many parts of the what became the Affordable Care Act, and very, very proud of it. The day that it was signed into law, it was just a great personal feeling to be part of that and to see what then has transpired since then in terms of coverage that people had that they never anticipated they would be able to afford or would ever be extended to them. It's really exciting.
So I could also sit here for 2 hours, but we won't, I promise. I wanted to divide our discussion into thirds. We'll talk for a few minutes about how the bill became a law, a little bit about what happened during implementation or what didn't happen during implementation, and then what do we do now? Where is the bill and what are we looking ahead to? So my first question actually goes back not to the successful effort to pass the ACA, but to the unsuccessful effort to pass a health overhaul under President Clinton. You were all in Congress then and all leaders on that effort too. What lessons did you learn from that failed effort that shaped your strategy for the Affordable Care Act?
Well, I think George mentioned the thing. It takes timing and personality, in a sense, to come together properly. And I was just saying to George before the program started, if you had tried to do what we did in 2008, 2009, a year or two before, it never would have happened. And you couldn't have done it a year afterwards. The window opened up. We had a president of the United States who really cared about this issue, Ted Kennedy, who 10 years ago gave a very moving speech in Denver at the Democratic Convention about health care and the importance of it. And I think those factors made possible for us to be able to achieve what we did. We had remarkable people like Nancy Pelosi. Harry Reid was tremendously helpful. Obviously, the president played a critical role as well. Those elements came together in that window that opened up, and we were able to drive the bill through it. You couldn't have done it before or immediately afterwards, in my view.
Well, something else happened, and that is, I was involved in Hillary Care. All of us were, one way or another. And the trouble with Hillary Care, first, in the right direction, and address coverage, cost, and everything else that we're worried about, is that it was top down. The administration had a bill, she had a bill, and told us, the Congress, to pass it. We're not a parliamentary form of government. We're a democracy. You cannot do that. And it didn't work. It was not thought through very well either. So the lesson learned there is, as a democracy, we, five of us here and others, whole Congress, worked assiduously, in great detail. It is so complicated. Trump said he didn't realize how complicated it was to pass this. And we worked really hard, and it was a total focus. But it was committees together and amendments. My God, I mean, Chris talks about the number of amendments the Republicans offered in the Health Committee. Same thing in the Finance Committee. We had umpteen amendments allowed, days of hearings. It was so transparent. I mean, it's almost embarrassing how transparent it was compared with today, where things are so not transparent at all. So the big difference, with my judgment, is top down, It was not terribly thought through. It was stillborn, but it laid the groundwork and the seeds significantly for later work for all of us.
President
just add
Obama,
to-
I think, learned very much from the failure under the Clintons. He realized the top-down wasn't going to work. He brought people into the White House for meetings, Republicans, Democrats, stakeholders, and he learned that he couldn't try to do too much. And the Clintons wanted to require every employer to provide health insurance, and and they relied on a Congress that was different than the Congress we were in when we were doing this bill, because you had those old committee chairmen who were so autocratic that Rostenkowski's committee was doing one bill, Dengel's committee was doing a different bill. It was very, very much unworked through, with the expectation that maybe we'd go to the floor and everything would happen. I remember Tom Foley, who's our speaker, said, I don't know what's going to result, but we'll just go through regular order, take votes, and whatever emerges will be the product. Well, President Obama said, we've got to take some ideas that the Republicans put out there. Competition with insurance companies. We should take what is it, that right-wing think tank that said we ought to have mandates. Heritage. They came up with the idea of mandates, and that was even part of the debate between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama in their presidential primary. But he learned that you had to get the Congress lined up. He made sure that all the staffs in the House and the Senate had a core bill that they would start with, work from there, and he made some deals with some of the interest groups, a lot of which I didn't like, but they thought that was the way to get the bill passed, and they were probably right. One of the most important forces that they brought in was pharma. Pharma stood to gain an enormous amount out of the Affordable Care Act, getting customers that they never had, people who couldn't afford drugs to buy them under the ACA. So pharma was very happy. Billy Tauzin, who had been a colleague of ours in the Energy and Commerce Committee, headed up that effort. And then when he finished, he was blasted by the drug companies because they're basically Republican and didn't like the fact that he helped get a successful bill for a Democratic administration. People learned from our failures, and we were determined not to repeat them.
George, you want to add something?
Well, I would just say that if you really look at it, it was a process that was inclusive in terms of the political players in the Congress, in the House and in the Senate. And you had two very, very skilled and very tough leaders in Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, who understood their membership. They knew where they could go, even if they didn't want to go there, and how you might have to take them there, but it was going to be about time, and it was going to be about intensity, and the meetings never stopped in the House or the Senate.
They never did stop.
Because everybody was taking... There was no other way to do it. The margins weren't there. And this is how it had to happen. And it played out, and there were a number of speed bumps that we knew were going to come. We didn't know in what form they were going to come, but they were managed. And this country has been talking about this for a long, 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 long time, and this was an opportunity that presented itself, but it's very different, as you pointed out, on Hillary Care. The foundations were laid before you got underway, and that was the big difference
At
here.
the risk of speaking twice here, remember the Harry Louise ads? They killed Hillary Care. They were so effective. We had nothing on our side to counter.
So let me ask you, because I was going to raise that, how many of you remember Harry and Louise? You do.
Harry Louise ads.
The Harry and Louise ads. And essentially what was decided was to bring everybody in the tent.
Could I just share one anecdote to be very brief?
and-
We were all at the White House. Oh, am I stepping on your
please
time?
go.
No, I thought you had finished. We were all at the White House. The Republicans were there. The president brought everybody together to talk about the framework that he wanted to pursue in the Affordable Care Act. And afterwards, one of the Republican colleagues said to me, hey, this is great. We were never invited to the White House when Bush was president. It's great to be here, and we're on the ground floor of something important. And that was the last positive conversation I had with that individual.
That was my next question. I mean, the biggest criticism that even I hear, how could they possibly have let this become law without any Republican support?
Well, let me add to that. By the way, you asked what changed. What changed was, it's a bit partisan, but it was true, and that is Barack Obama was elected president, and we took over the majority in the House, and Nancy Pelosi became the Speaker. Look, we tried in the Senate, you did some talk across party lines.
Some.
On the House side, we thought it was endless.
I know you did.
But we tried, but it was impossible. The polarization that existed in the House could not be bridged. And these two characters would have been glad to and did, Henry and George, work on a bipartisan basis. On the Ways and Means Committee, we were totally stonewalled. They did not want to participate. And as you look back, the polarization that exists today in this country that has been intensified was very much prevalent back then. Very much prevalent. And as hard as we tried on the House side, they had one supreme determination, and that was not to have universal health care become the law of this country.
And not to let Obama have a victory. Because so early, they met and made a decision. We had a recession, the deepest recession we ever had since the Great Depression. And they said, we're not going to vote for that stimulus bill, even though they were for a stimulus bill with George Bush. We're not going to be participating in the Affordable Care Act because we don't want to give them the accomplishment. It isn't that we had Republicans that were so hard-nosed. Their leaders insisted that they follow in line and oppose everything. They opposed the Wall Street reform bills, the Dodd-Frank bill. There was very little where we had bipartisan support. The budget negotiations, we could have accomplished a lot, and President Obama tried it, and the Republicans wouldn't go along. We were not at the polarized position that we are now, but that was clearly a road to the time we didn't, to the point where now we don't even talk to each other.
Well, Senator Baucus, you spent how many months and you had been working closely with Senator Grassley, your counterpart, because the Senate had changed hands so many times, it was never quite clear who was the chairman and who was the ranking member.
Oh, yes, it was.
What changed, though? I mean, you had worked together so closely for so long.
Right. So on that point, if I might, we tried mildly to make sure this was I hate this word, a bipartisan bill. And the Republicans started with us. Why? Because this was an opportunity to do something we had to do. Pass legislation to address healthcare needs in the country. We didn't have a healthcare system in the United States until this was a big deal.
And a lot of it was their idea.
And so the Republicans on the committee worked with us trying to find the truth, trying to find how things work. Nobody knew how things worked in the committee. Didn't understand Medicare, didn't understand Medicaid, didn't understand hospital reimbursement, didn't understand anything really. So we had all these hearings, and what Republicans and Democrats asking all these questions of witnesses. How does this work? How does this happen? It was wonderful. We were in together. The further we got to the end, as you said, then it became extremely partisan. Just one little story which I think capsulizes it all. Chuck Grassley and I are working well together, as you said. And we had a press conference in one portion of the bill to tout something. And afterwards, that day, he said, Max, I got to talk to you. He sat me down on the floor of the Senate, and he says, I can't be seen with you again. Why? Mitch said he'd saw me off. He'd primaried me in Iowa. He'd cut me off. I can't be seen with you.
Mitch being Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader.
Majority leader of the United States Senate.
He's softened since then.
And it's so partisan, as you know, he said, now one Republican vote, House or Senate, your question is how did we do it? We were seized. We kept meeting. We're going to make this thing happen. And it was all in good faith. There was very little rancor, bitterness at all among all of us. We were going to make this thing work.
And historians have written how impatient we House Democrats were with what was going on in the Senate, because we thought it would never work. And it turned out McConnell said early on their chief objective was to make sure that Obama wasn't reelected.
Yeah.
And so we said, good luck, but it won't work. And we kept working, it happened.
So the only way to get this through, well, the only way to get it through the Senate, since there were no Republicans, was to get all 60 Democrats. And it was
Right.
a historic moment of having 60 Democrats. It didn't last very long. How hard was it to get all 60 Democrats?
It was always hard.
Try herding cats for a living.
Right, it is.
That's some idea. I wanted to just reinforce the point that Max and others are making in the Senate. As the acting chair of the Labor Committee, we did a markup that lasted 5 weeks. The Labor Committee was first formulated in 1869. This was the longest markup in the history of that committee, going back to 1869. 800 amendments were filed. We debated 300 amendments. I accepted 161 Republican amendments and did not produce a single vote. We came down to passage of the bill coming out of committee. So a great effort was made. And all the meetings that occurred beforehand, that Henry has mentioned and others, at the White House as well as on Capitol Hill, trying to bring people along. But there was a determination made by the Republican leadership that they would never agree to anything involving this issue, and understanding why. It wasn't just politics. They understood that if we could adopt this, it would change the issue forever. We could never go back. We established the notion that health care was a right on this bill, and that universality of health care was going to be critically important. And they were determined to defeat that, because that would change everything in terms of them going forward. And I think, regardless of what else has happened to this bill, we've established, I think, that principle with this bill.
Well, we waited for such a long time before the Senate finally passed a bill, which was on Christmas Eve.
At 7 in the
In a
morning.
snowstorm.
In a snowstorm.
That's when all those, I forget what they call that, those Republican groups that would come and Tea Party. That's when the Tea Party was growing up, rising up, going to meetings, getting a lot of attention, claiming that what this was a bill about death panels. They were going to take people's lives away if they're old and sick. And they propagandized without the ability of our side to counter it, because we didn't have a bill. And so I just think that fact hurt us a lot. We finally got a bill passed, and then we had to work in 2009 to reconcile the two bills, which was another interesting experience when the 60 votes that they had in the Senate was there to pass the bill, but not to pass any changes in it out of a conference that ordinarily would resolve the difference between the House and the Senate.
And the House always loves to accept a Senate bill.
Yes.
No, the truth of the matter is,
You guys could write.
as Henry and George would tell you, we were left with no choice.
Max, we're outnumbered here.
We were left with no, and there were pieces in it.
But you're right.
that
At
were
that point, they
difficult.
had theoretically killed the bill. If the House insisted upon going forward, then the game was over.
Exactly.
But we had to take their bill without all the perfecting that we knew needed to be done. You just had to go. If you wanted this law, you had to go.
And then reconciliation did not require 60 votes.
Right.
We could pass reconciliation with a simple majority.
Right.
So the
Which
bill
is why
can
the
be back.
Affordable
We
Care
assume
is
you've all
actually
studied
two
for this
different
exam
laws.
on the Senate rules.
See, Julie, we're doing what you said we should not do, spend so much time on this.
Process.
I know, but I do think it's important. I want, before
It's
we move
vital.
on, I want to just ask one more thing, because this is still a tension that exists now. The House bill had a public option in it. The Senate tried to do at least some kind of a Medicare buy-in, and you couldn't get the 60th vote for it, or the 59th either. So in the end, there was no sort of acknowledgement towards single payer. That was hard to then get back through the House, right?
Yes.
Well, we were sorry to give it up. And we thought we would fight for it in conference, but the Senate didn't have it in there. But when you had 60 votes in the Senate, 60 Democratic votes, and we needed 60 votes to pass the bill in the Senate, any one senator could insist on exactly what he wanted. And we saw that with a number of senators, including a couple senators. One that comes to mind, it was your colleague from Connecticut, my good friend. He said, I won't vote for a bill with a public option.
Senator Lieberman.
I was trying to keep him.
You know, Julie, this is an important point.
And if I might, go ahead.
I was going to say, some years ago, and we talked about this before today, I once heard Ted Kennedy say, I asked him one time, we're just chatting, is there anything you regret during your public career that you could have legislatively done differently? And I'll never forget saying that he regretted deeply that he didn't pick up Richard Nixon's idea on a individual mandate bill of universality. The benefits weren't too great in the bill, and many people opposed it because it wasn't rich enough. But he always regretted that they didn't do that. You build on things. And while certainly it was disappointing to lose the public option, we weren't going to miss the opportunity to put something in place. You can always come back and build on it. True. But if you destroy it altogether, you have to start de novo. And that is painful, as we've learned.
I mean, it was a basic decision you had to make. Myself and a lot of other people, and people who were in Congress before me, had spent their whole career trying to figure out how to move to national health care, single payer, public option, however you do it, to get there. And then we were faced with the reality, with the Senate bill coming, and we couldn't move our bill. Right. Do you get 20 or 30 million people into the healthcare system that can't get their take because being a woman is a pre-existing condition? Yeah. Do you change this or don't you change it? Yeah. You hold out, we made a decision. The Speaker wasn't going to have any other decision made, but we made the decision that we were going to go with this bill. Yeah. And we would have loved it. You know, I spent, and my father before me, and you know, on national health care. It just wasn't in the cards, but a lot of good could happen. Yeah. And this system, I still believe, with this president, is going to lead you eventually there because states are understanding there's economies and inclusiveness. Right. The exceptions get really expensive in healthcare. And so we'll see. I mean, obviously it's not going to happen tomorrow, but the fact of the matter is a lot of people, you know, who spent many years in the Congress fighting for this had to make that decision and go home and tell their people that I couldn't do it.
And Julie, you remember how difficult it was to pass the bill in the House in the first place.
Yeah.
The three of us sat there. We were 5-6 votes short. Remember? Nancy said, we're 5-6 votes short. And that led to the discussion with Bart Stupak and others. Yeah. And because there was enough belief we had to, at long last, bring health care into the homes, health care insurance of everybody, or virtually everybody, that we took the steps, including that one. We have to remember how difficult it was to pass.
Yeah. And how fragile it was. Ted Kennedy, the election to replace him was won by Scott Brown, a Republican in Massachusetts. All of a sudden, the 60 votes are gone. And so what Henry said is absolutely the case. You lose one of those votes, and you're done. It's just an academic exercise at that point.
You want to add to it? Don't forget, Social Security had a hard time when it was first introduced. Look at it today. Let me build on it. Medicare as well. The basic point is you can't have perfection. You do the best you can with what you got, and you build on it afterwards. And that's the basic premise.
So I want to move on to implementation. Clearly one of the biggest problems was that the law was so big and complicated that it was hard to explain for you and easy for opponents to demagogue. What could you have done differently after it passed to help build support? Because it seems that you know, a lot of it, that was where the opposition had a chance to really foment itself.
Well, marketing. I mean, I say respectfully, I think we did a terrible job of educating the American public about what this was. It's a complicated subject matter for even the brightest and most knowledgeable people to understand. And I don't think we did anywhere near the job we should have done of educating people about why this was valuable, how it would work. And then, of course, you had the problem in terms of the implementation that was a mess and led further to the demagoguery. But despite that, you know, the worst month I think we had, and someone's mentioned it already, was that month of August in 2009 after we had finished the bill in the Labor Committee on July 15th. And that it took time. Obviously, Max was trying to get Republicans in that committee. And so it went to October. That month, it was just a dreadful, dreadful month. Yeah. But Henry said something earlier that needs reinforcing. Despite what was terrible politics, when members came back in September, there was no shrinking away from the goal to go forward. Yeah. Normally that might happen. I don't know if we remember what it was like in August of 2009, but the town hall meetings were devastating. But people came back, committed as ever, to make this happen.
We were not tough enough in marketing it.
Yeah.
I have a view, Republicans like to win. They don't like to govern. Democrats like to govern, we don't like to win. We don't have the same juggler instinct to win.
Thank
And
God, in
and
some cases, too.
Generally, I agree with that. But you got to be tough, honestly, good faith,
Yeah,
but
I know.
tough. And we, as Democrats, the president,
Terrible.
did not market it well. I mean, I remember all those things we faced, death panels and all this stuff.
Because there was an assumption that the signing of the bill was the end of the fight.
I know, but
on our side. I mean, you're right.
We're going to
we
talk
blew it.
about pre-existing conditions and all the great coverage and all that.
Pre-existing conditions saved us.
Yeah, I think so.
No, I think we could have done better, but I remember meetings after we passed it, and I was struck by the vituperation in part of the public.
That's true.
And we paid a high price for success. We should all remember that. But I think the health bill sparked within the public a deep, deep disagreement about how we should proceed, the role of government, and the health bill became really the magnet. And when I came home after we passed and had gatherings, the vituperation, the hatred that people came forth with about why are we providing health care for people who are lazy, who don't work? We worked hard to get our health care. Let them work hard for their health care. And we've seen that magnified these last years. So we could have done better than marketing. But we made a decision after all these years, despite the deep economic distress, to do health care. And it turned out to be very difficult. I think I would add the main thing we have to do is be damn proud of what we did.
Oh, yeah.
Most of the time after a big bill passes, Congress comes back, sometimes very soon thereafter, and does what are called technical corrections, which are sometimes not so technical. I mean, ways of basically smoothing out things that don't work. Of course, the Democrats lost the House that fall of 2010. The bill was signed in March, so there wasn't really a chance to do technical corrections, and there never has been.
It was repeal.
Are there,
80
but
votes.
are there technical corrections that any of you would have wanted to do that you couldn't because the Democrats no longer had control of the House?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Any
Always did.
specific one?
A bill that's less than a page long can have unintended consequences. Not one of us here would disagree with it.
I mean, but how big a problem was that in the implementation that you couldn't go back legislatively and fix
problem.
stuff?
Oh, it was huge. So you ended up with the White House doing it in an ad hoc fashion. Fortunately, various parts of the healthcare community and the nation supported some of those efforts, and you were able to, try to smooth this out. But that's all you could do. You weren't going to go back to the Congress. It wasn't going to happen. And it was, whether it was the right decision, there was no other decision. There wasn't a choice at that point.
But it was thoroughly irresponsible that we couldn't pass a corrections bill. There's never been a complicated piece of legislation where there isn't follow-on legislation to make the corrections. Republicans wouldn't let us take a bill up. They said the only bill they would consider would be repeal. They didn't even talk about replace. They didn't have a replacement, but they didn't have a replacement, but then they had started to talk about repeal and replace, and then we found out they didn't have a replacement. They never thought it through, but they got a lot of mileage out of demagoguing it and telling people this is a terrible law. And, the best anecdote is when people would come up in meetings that all of us experienced it, when some elderly person would come up and say, I don't want government-run health care. I'm on Medicare. Leave it alone. And they really did not want those people to get insurance. They had what they had, and they didn't want to pay taxes for those other people. So there's a lot of ignorance about how the government and how healthcare works, and the Republicans played to that ignorance, and they're still playing to that ignorance on a whole range of subjects.
You couldn't leave the back. You couldn't leave the field. You couldn't say, well, we now have the law. You just had to hang in there, and so many of the solutions were really sort of jerry-rigged. You didn't know if they were going to hold up 6 months, 18 months, or a year, and what was going to happen, but you had to push forward. You couldn't leave the bill the way it is without an effort at these technical corrections. Huge ramifications across all of the healthcare field and across state governments. And so you just had to push forward. I mean, you know, let's remember there was a line set by the Senate leader that Obama was going to get nothing, including a second term. He was going to get nothing, and he never varied from that. So, thinking you were going to get assistance, you're on your own. Start working on your own wounds here and get going. I mean, this was such a break from the historical roles of the parties in the Congress, in the government, and how we govern.
Yeah, they blame the president for executive authority when they refuse to use congressional authority.
It goes back to the point, though. They understood what we were doing. This was going to change things. Much as in 1960s with Medicare, with Medicaid, with the civil rights law, the civil rights, we were setting a precedent here that could not be reversed in time. They can pick away at this, but the American public, when you poll them on these issues, they believe that health care is a right. They believe it ought to be universal and how we achieve that. That has not changed. In fact, I think we helped contribute significantly to those conclusions. And that's what Republicans are most afraid of, in a sense.
And that's what they've got to worry about right now.
That's a problem.
Because they want to repeal it and replace it, but they would be so vilified. Look, we went from people saying, I hate this Obamacare, but I like the Affordable Care Act. And then we had people say, I don't like the Affordable Care Act, but I sure am happy I have insurance. And I thought Senator Manchin made a very telling statement when he said, a lot of people don't know where or how they got health insurance. But if it's repealed and taken away from them, they'll know who took it away. So that's we'll see. They're trying to cripple it, sabotage it through
and you see that
different
tension,
strategies.
You see that tension between Republican governors and this administration. The Republican governors say, so you're going to dump 5 million people onto the state government here when you guys can pick up 90% of the cost, so we can get acclimated and organized here. So this isn't over. This isn't over. No, because people understand it. I mean, we go back to pre-existing conditions. Remember what it was like to be on the street and have parents come to you and tell you that their kids couldn't get insurance. They couldn't be on their parents' policy, either because of age or because of a pre-existing condition. What that meant for the access to health care for basically middle-class families across the country, but people were excluded. That was the interest of the industry at that time, to get rid of high cost, what might potentially be high cost. Those people are in the system today. I want to meet the governor that throws those kids off of policies.
And we never had a Justice Department go into court and argue against a law duly passed by the Congress, as we see now, where our Justice Department is saying, do away with pre-existing conditions. It's really an outrage.
What is it, 62% of bankruptcies in this country are related to health care crises in a family. 62%.
Julie, what's happening, I think, is more and more people are telling their stories, and physicians are telling the stories, and hospitals are telling the stories, and nurses. I was in Iowa for a different purpose, and a woman said this to about 15 of us. I worked, I got breast cancer, I had health care, it went into remission, I lost my job, my health care came back, I had ACA, and she said, if it weren't for that, I wouldn't be here today. And essentially, she was saying to us, I wouldn't be alive today. And that's what's happening in this country. And it's a tribute to this struggle. And we here who haven't been together very much, I think we'll stick together to make sure we don't lose it, right?
So going forward, Democrats seem divided about whether to keep pushing down the road of the ACA, the incremental gains, or defending them at this point, or trying to do something, move to a single payer. Can the Democrats have a unified position going into 2018 and 2020? Should they? I mean, how is health going to play as a political issue in the next campaign?
We should have a unified position for universal coverage. Not a single payer, but universal coverage. Ted Kennedy and I introduced a single payer bill. Then we introduced an employer mandate. And then we've done other things over the years to get more people covered. And I worked very hard to get Medicaid extended to more people, low-income people. And somebody asked me, well, Medicaid's not such a great system. Why don't you just get universal coverage? Well, what do you do with those people who benefit from the incremental steps? We are not going to pass, even if the Democrats take back the Congress, a single-payer bill. It's just something that's not doable for a lot of reasons. But where we come together is we want universal coverage, whether it be through people having insurance through their jobs, or Medicare, or Medicaid, or individual policies. This fills in the gaps, and we got to keep working on that, not look for something that's a big promise that we can't keep.
Yeah, I agree with
that
Henry.
was the,
I agree with Henry. When I was chairman of the Finance Committee, this is a bit difficult, but I did what I thought I had to do. I had several rules. One, everything is on the table. Every proposal that has anything to do with health care is on the table. Because if anybody wants to take something off the table, then somebody else can rationalize why his or hers should also be off the table. I spent so much of my time calling heads of all the health organizations, keeping them at the table so they wouldn't leave. Pharma, hospitals, docs, medical device manufacturing. Sorry?
Yeah.
And they're the toughest. and it's just all constantly, Chamber of Commerce, BRT, labor, to keep everybody together constantly, not just senators, but the outside organizations. They keep them together with one exception, and that was single pay. I took that off the table. And I did that because I didn't think we were ready in this country at that time to pass it. And as Chris just basically implied, there was one senator, and probably more, who had voted against it. You only need one senator to stop it. I do believe now is the time. Now is the time. We talked about this earlier this morning, all of us, and we all agree very much universal coverage is an effort that we should now undertake very strongly. Even though I was not a favor of single pay back then, I do think that we need civil today, and I hope we can pursue it.
That was the whole point of the Affordable Care Act. This was to establish, by federal regulation, national health insurance for people, with the idea that we would then battle costs and bring them down. That was a universal health care bill. The elements of it, of the mandate, the individual mandate, of having the subsidization, the tax subsidization, and thirdly, dealing with the pre-existing conditions, so you would never be excluded from health care. That's universality, or at least a good beginning of it, if not completely so.
So much of the focus is on people being able to buy an individual policy without being discriminated against. And that's certainly a very important part of the law. But another part was that we put in requirements for minimum benefits, whether you got your insurance. However, we had to have certain minimum benefits. It was going to be a decent, comprehensive policy that people would be able to buy. And then the bill provided for some experimentation in the delivery of health care through affordable care organizations, and trying to deal with the problems with people with serious medical conditions where they didn't need a system where they're going from one doctor. They needed a team to work on those problems. There was an idea of a lot of experimentation. And those things would have brought us closer together so that whether you're on an individual policy or on Medicaid or whatever it was, we had an expectation of what the healthcare system was going to be. And then we have to figure out how to hold down the cost. And then maybe at that point, we can bring it all together into one system. But I want to be sure we get everybody covered and start holding down the costs, because we can't say we're going to give everybody everything. There's one liberal group out in Washington that said, and I like them a lot, but they said, oh, if you give us money, we'll get you a single payer, and you'll never have an out-of-pocket expense again. We're going to give you every benefit you possibly could imagine. Long-term care, nursing home care, preventive care, and we're going to pay for it all. But they never say how they're going to pay for it all. So I think, let's hope for the best for the future, but we got to lay the groundwork to get there by making sure that human lives are protected so they get the care they need.
Right, we're going to turn it to...
Julie, just quickly.
Okay, one sounds good, and then
Right.
we need our first audience question.
There are differences as to where we proceed from here. But one thing's clear, and I can say this from what's going on individually in districts, there's unity that we have to keep what we've had and build on it. And so there are differences, but we have a fundamental basis, and there's a deep determination. I think public opinion has been changing as people have experienced the benefits. And what was not so popular before is now increasingly understood as something this nation must achieve. And so I think a warning to everybody who voted for 50, 60 repeals, I think you're going to find out that the public may decide that you're the one to repeal, not health care.
I think somebody has or is about to have a microphone. Please tell us who you are when you ask your question, and please make it a question and not a speech.
Emily Peterson. I work for InnovAge, which provides the program of all-inclusive care for the elderly. My question is this: I think that the gap in marketing that you discussed, my hypothesis is that it created the fertile soil for the shameful racism we see in so many ways coming out in our country in the last several years, and added fuel to that portion of our country. Did you have any indication that, do you agree with that hypothesis? Did you have any indication in the listening tours that you were doing that those other people that we were going to be covering was in fact going to translate into this racism? And if so, would you have done anything differently to try to stem that tide?
What's the question?
I'm sorry, I don't
Did
do
we
anything
know that
differently?
we weren't doing a good enough job convincing people how good this bill was and what we were trying to accomplish, which laid the opening for the Republicans to demagogue us and attack us? And we saw it, and we tried to deal with it, but and we're still dealing with it.
We came back in September of 2009 after the month of August, which was, again, that just every night you got shots at these town hall meetings. I fully expected us, maybe even some Democrats, to sort of wither a little bit with that kind of an onslaught back, where these people were showing up in droves in town hall meetings. But as I said a moment ago, one of the things I'm most proud of that effort is the leadership didn't weaken and the members stood with it. But we were certainly conscious and aware. And a lot of members were fully aware they were probably going to lose their seats in some place for being for it. But I love the fact that we served with colleagues who recognized that what we were doing was far more important than their seat, in a sense. And
I'd
today
say
we're in better shape.
During the 36 years I was in the Senate, I never experienced vitriol like this. It was over the ACA. Back home, people were so ticked off, so many people, so angry. It was death panels, you name it, is all it. But I found, now I can say this because Montana is more of a retail state, it's not a big wholesale state like California and so forth, that if I could sit down and explain 2 hours at a meeting of 20, 30, up to 200 people, just take all questions and explain it all, it made a big difference. They weren't in favor of it afterwards, but they were less upset than they were before. Because I think most people, they really want people representing them to know that at least your representative is aware of and has listened to the other side. And doesn't have to totally agree, but it's not jam something down their throats. So when you're home, when you're listening, you're talking, that goes a long, long way to dissipate a lot of the vitriol.
Over here.
Dan Ovadi, orthopedic surgeon. I had the opportunity of talking to Senator Baucus a couple days ago, and he was kind enough to listen to me. The one thing I haven't heard, and I think this is another way to approach it, is let's come up with an honest way to fund healthcare. And my proposal, which I gave to Senator Baucus, is we need some national sales tax, consumption tax that goes to healthcare. And you get rid of things you have currently in payroll taxes and deductions and here and there. And it goes to healthcare. Everyone knows, everyone pays into it. It's not means tested.
You're going to support that, aren't you?
Anyway, I don't want to go into details, but why don't we talk about financing?
Can I just talk about, say, when you go to Canada, you're paying for their health care in your sales tax.
And drugs.
But no, there's literally a tack on, it doesn't say that's what it's for,
Every
but you're
time you
paying
spell it
an
right.
extra Canadian
Finally,
tax.
we've got an American president who stands up to the Canadians. That's
But you looked at using a broad-based tax to fund this, right?
Today. Stands up today.
It's just easier said than done. So
Yeah, it is.
It just, I mean, no,
No.
it's just, look, we have, to change the subject for a minute, we have this immense infrastructure problem in this country, totally immense. And we can't get consideration, seriously, of how to pay. So it's easier said than done.
Well, especially when we give so much money in tax breaks. We did it under President Bush, George W. Bush. He had a lot of Democrats vote with him on it. It was a mistake. It created this huge deficit. And I think part of the reason we have this tax bill that just passed is to create a big deficit again so they could go after Medicare and Medicaid
Absolutely.
and Social Security.
won't come.
So it's I wouldn't say any idea to fund health care where everybody feels they're contributing to it in a fair way and they're getting benefit from it is out of the question. I think it's a good idea to continue to think through.
All the way over here? Oh well. Sorry, I didn't realize you were standing with the microphone.
Stephen Summer, Colorado Hospital Association. The pendulum really began to swing when the states had the option to pull out and choose whether to come in because of the Supreme Court decision. I wonder if you'd comment on, knowing that, would you have done something different to keep the states in? Because when they chose to come out, we then lost the coverage for many people around the country.
Well, the short answer for me is that helped a lot. That was a safety valve. The states could have their own exchanges.
Well, that wasn't just
I think the question's about the Medicaid expansion.
Extending Medicaid was, we adopted a bill that was supposed to have Medicaid to cover people that were designated as beneficiaries and the expansion of Medicaid. And then the Supreme Court came in, despite a long line of decisions saying that if they want to be on Medicaid, they have to accept the rules. They suddenly said, well, this is too big a change. They're going to have to accept those rules. And I think in some ways, people are now seeing how narrow-minded their states were when they didn't expand it. Their neighboring states had expanded Medicaid. It helped their economy. It helped their people. And there were Republicans in those states that didn't want to help their own citizens. And then, ironically, now they're doing it because they can make people go to work. That's become the Republican mantra of saying why they can accept the Medicaid expansion. But we'll get there.
There's a story, too, just the other day, I don't know if any of you saw it, but how some of the insurance companies are going back into the states at a time when obviously there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen to this bill. And that's a positive. They're doing so because there's greater profitability today than there was, given the rising costs. But I found it somewhat encouraging that these smaller, it wasn't some of the larger companies, but certainly smaller ones are going back in to these states in pretty significant numbers in a number of states where you wouldn't have necessarily expected it.
Time for one more question, and then I have a closing question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so a quick question on the 2020 election and the politics of healthcare. So I think a lot of us would take Joe from Washington, D.C., I think a lot of us would take a backseat with our own policy perspectives and favor a candidate that gives us the best chance of getting Trump out of office in 2020. What's your sense of the right political play there? Is it transformational, a la universal health care, single payer, or is it something closer to incrementalism?
I'd just like to win.
Yeah, Julie, this is, I mean, it's hard to answer that because this is being held, and we again appreciate it in a nonpartisan way. My suggestion is you ask each of us afterwards. We'll be glad to give you a strong opinion.
you're clearly, you're going through a change here in terms of participation, who participated in the past, who's participating in the present, and you're just going to have to sort this out. This isn't a question of can we anoint the right candidate, the right person. You don't get that in politics. You certainly don't get it in politics today in terms of how people communicate and the instantaneous communications, rebuttal back and forth. So, speaking as a Democrat, you're going to have to sort this out. There's going to be people that come that are very attractive, I think, at this time, and we'll see. But you don't get to do that in America. Rarely.
Let me step back a little bit. Obviously, looking at former members of Congress here. But if you ask me what were the single most important elections in 5 months from now, I would tell you they're state elections. You've got 25 states in this country where you have a trifecta. A Republican governor, and both houses are controlled by the Republican Party. Those parties that will do the reapportionment after the midterm in the 20th election, deciding how to gerrymander those districts, will end up being unable for years to come, another decade possibly, of getting people elected that can make a difference on these issues. So we need to build. We have a very small bench because we lost an awful lot of seats over the last 8 years at the state legislative level. We need to rebuild this party if we're going to be successful. And this is a perfect opportunity this year to focus on how to rebuild it. And again, I'd love to take the House back and take the Senate back, but I'm more concerned about what happens at a state level for the long-term interests of these issues.
Well, I think it's important here, too, to say this. During my time in the Congress, reporters would always ask me process questions. What's going to happen? Is this bill going to pass? Is that amendment going to pass? And I learned right away, you don't answer a process question with process. Rather, you answer a process question with substance and goals and what you believe should happen and work to make that happen. And it's a lead into something that's really corny, but I think it's really accurate. You're in charge. The people in this country are in charge. You make happen what you want to happen. Don't keep asking what's going to happen, what's going to happen. I know it's corny, but it's really true. The more you get involved, it's going to be results you're going to like.
I want to ask one last question, and I want a yes or no answer. I really want a yes or no answer, because we're really out of time.
We'll have to go to therapy.
Given
We got mental health parity.
This is what you were just talking about. In the wake of the Affordable Care Act's passing, Democrats basically lost, the House, eventually the Senate, the state houses, the governorships. Is what you gained having passed this law worth the sort of devastation to the party? Yes or no?
Well, yes. Senators have a right
senator
to
for crying out loud.
filibuster. I have a right to filibuster.
I think so.
You also have
in an empty chamber,
six-year
though.
terms.
Yes, it's worth it, but we should be losing seats over it, in my view. And so that combination. Yes, I think we absolutely.
Absolutely yes on my part. And I want to remind people that after President Johnson got some tremendously important legislation passed, the Democratic margin in the Congress dropped. It wasn't because they didn't like those laws, but that those things happen, and we've got to. I think we've got to reform the campaign system. We've got to make sure people understand that there are consequences to their votes, and then fight for what we believe in. If you're going to be all things to everybody by taking no stand, you're going to be nothing. So I'm proud that we passed it, even though we lost the election afterwards.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt.
That's my view,
That's
too.
3 words.
Well, I can't count.
No, I'll say absolutely. Because what's the alternative? Not passing
I'll
it?
say absolutely. That's 7 words.
That's because you're in California.
So I'm the last one, so.
That's a lot more now.
46 words.
No. Yes.
Got a paragraph
I think our experiences show the biggest mistake is to oversimplify, and our careers show the struggle it took to pass this, and for 2020, I think we have to be sure we don't oversimplify the issue, but highlight what is really important. I think the 5 of us say, are we glad we did what we did? You're damn right.
Next time we're going to ask you for your tweet.
On behalf of all of us, it was 43 years ago. 4 of us arrived on the very same day in January of 1975 to be in Congress. None of us even imagined that day that some 30-odd years, 35, 36 years later, we would have ended up chairing the 4 committees along with our good friend Sandy in the Ways and Means Committee. And this is the first time since all of us have left Congress, and the first time since we actually passed the legislation, that someone has brought us together. So I think on behalf of all of us, we deeply appreciate the fact the Aspen Institute and you as well as
but if I did, I would be bringing it down. Thank you very much, panel. Thank you, audience.
Okay, good job.